This is Guideposts with Dr. Tim Stauffer, a podcast where Tim and his friends engage in purposeful conversation about identity, parenting, culture, faith, and more. Tim Stauffer is a professor of counseling and a licensed clinical counselor. My name is Sam Mayung, and I'm Tim's friend. My life has been greatly enriched by my time talking to Tim and getting his thoughts on many matters that impact my life daily. After listening to this podcast, I hope you'll feel the same. Guideposts are discernment markers. They provide opportunities for direction as well as warnings of pitfalls. Go this way and be careful of that way. We hope that each episode provides some sense of direction as we navigate the challenges of daily life. Thanks so much for listening. Quick disclaimer, the content of this podcast is for educational purposes only. It is not intended to be a substitute for professional advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Always seek the advice of your licensed mental health provider. Tim, good morning.
Good morning, Sam.
All right, today we're going to talk about what you're calling a roadmap to relational repair. First, I think it'd be helpful to talk about for a couple minutes why are we going to talk about this. I think first off, everyone has relationships in their life that are in need of repair. It's almost synonymous to being human is to have relationships in your life that are hurting or broken in some way and in need of healing. And I want to hear your thoughts on that.
Sure. Well, one of the sad realities is that one of the predictors of divorce is the inability to make effective repair within relationship. And so relationships are always being injured and repaired across time. And so much like a muscle that we work out, when we work out a muscle really hard, it really is a form of injury, but it's the kind of injury that strengthens the muscle. And so we actually gain strength from the injury or from the working out. And so relational conflict can be similar to that in the sense that if we repair well, we are enhancing and strengthening the relationship within the repair. One of the things that keeps people from being willing to repair. That's a great
analogy, yeah.
Yeah, and so the thing that keeps us from being willing to repair is often the sense that to engage in conflict or to have conflict is to ruin the relationship or to damage the relationship in such a way that we might lose it. And so many people are avoidant of conflict and avoidant or don't know how to repair. And so the relationship, rather than strengthening, gets diminished or gets compromised. And the idea of like dying by 1,000 paper cuts will happen in a marriage or in other close relationships if we don't have a solid structure for repairing damage. And so I'm wondering, do you have like any stories or any, how has this been working out in our personal lives in terms of as we reflect back on our stories? I think what are the ways that we have seen successes as it relates to repair, and the places where it's like, dang, it'd be nice to have a stronger repair system. Yeah. And wondered if you have anything you might want to
yes,
talk about in that regard.
Yes, I do. Well, I think, successes, I feel like one of the spaces where I do feel the most successful in the idea of relational repair would be in my marriage. Or at least I feel the benefits of conflict resolution the most there. It's a space where it's the most inevitable and happens the most frequent. But I've experienced the depth of relationship with my wife unlike anybody else because of what you're describing, this like the tearing to make it stronger, like the working out of a muscle. So I have experienced that and can speak firsthand to the benefits of that. But that has not come without lots of, failures and not doing it correctly. And I'm personally prone to avoid conflict. I think I've probably said that before. In fact, there's this one time where my wife actually was in a conflict with a friend of ours, and we're in the living room, and I see it coming, and Rachel confronts the friend like head on, and next thing I know, I'm in the basement by myself, not realizing, like, I did not have a reason to go down into the basement. It was legitimately just my body's reaction to, oh no, conflict, get out of there. And I just left the living room. And so after a couple minutes of realizing that I legitimately just ran away, I forced myself to go back upstairs and participate in the conversation that was uncomfortable, and what it ended up being fine. But that's an example of, I will remove myself from the situation if possible. I will oftentimes avoid. I like the thought of 1,000 paper cuts. I'll take the 1,000 paper cuts kind of thing, but that only lasts so long, and eventually, like, it builds up and you explode. And
so you eventually bleed out.
You bleed out. Like, yeah. So even to hear you set the table with the idea of, like, we got to view relational repair as a good thing and as the, like, strengthening of a relationship is already, like, a good reminder for me, even coming in this conversation this morning.
Right. When I think about relational repair, we can't help but think back across our lifespan and thinking in terms of, we've been taught how to deal with conflict. It's like it's just that we've often been taught through watching it modeled, and oftentimes that's done very ineffectively or very poorly, and so we see the damage of undealt with conflict, or conflict that hasn't been repaired, and we see the kind of the cancerous process unfold over time if we don't go about repair. And so not repairing is like, it introduces an infection or like a cancer or some sort of progressive process that just gets worse over time. And we want to keep, if we want to have healthy relationships, we want to engage the conflict so that we can be strengthened. And one of the most important components of being willing to engage conflict is the confidence and security that the relationship will be able to hold together if I engage in the conflict. Many people are scared that they're not going to be able to hold together. So our own personal sense of, do I have the strength myself to hold together, let alone can the relationship hold together? And so you talked about running to the basement. It's like, oftentimes people will have that fight or run or freeze kind of response to conflict, and some people get very aggressive very quickly, and it's like, I'll scratch your eyes out, like, and I'll get after it. Another person will duck for cover and run. Some people will just kind of go blank and just kind of ball up and go in fetal position and not be able to function and just kind of wait it out. And so all of those are kind of neurological processes. They're body responses that we have learned over time. And so we need to unlearn some of those kinds of processes so that we can engage. And I think it really starts with and this would be the first stopping point on a roadmap or on a process is we can think about using this roadmap for very severe breaches of trust and betrayal within a relationship where there's like a very significant injury to the relationship. We can also think about it in terms of a more rapid kind of repair model where we move through these 5 movements or these 5 points on the map relatively quickly. And we don't even think about them. But in significant injuries in the relationship, we actually have to think about them as kind of a process over time.
Okay.
And so the first stopping point is the question of grace. And grace is a theological term that's fairly common in our vocabulary. But it's a sense of kindness. It's a sense of, I'm going to give something to you that's undeserved. Theologically, it's that God gives us something good, and we didn't earn it. We didn't deserve it, but he is, out of his generosity, giving it to us. And in many regards, if we're in conflict with a spouse or with another important person in our lives, we have to ask ourselves the question of, am I willing to give something undeserved to the other person? And so that may mean just a matter of, I'm willing to stay in it. I'm not gonna turn tail and run.
Yeah.
And I'm here with you, and I am here, and I'm committed to being in this process. So in a really severe injury, we might think if one partner would have an affair,
sure.
The question of grace is the first question of like, am I willing to engage? And so the offended partner is going to be making a decision over time of, will this end the relationship, or will I stay in it? And for repair to occur, that becomes the first movement of I'm, at least for now, I am in it. I'm not going to be in it then out, in and out. It's like I'm in this, and it's the first step of the process. The person who hurts the relationship needs to give a gift of grace also. And that often can express itself in something along the lines of, I want you to take as much time as you need to recover. I recognize that the injury that occurred threatens the relationship, and I'm going to be patient with you, and I'm going to do my own work, and I am going to be in this with you, and I am going to give a gift of patience. And I'm going to allow you to have as much space and time as you need to recover. And that act of grace is like the first, what I would call like repentant kind of space of recognizing the damage I did to you is significant. It hurt you, and you're going to need space and time. And if I think you're going to be able to move through that quickly, I really haven't done repentance. I really haven't come to terms with the significance of what I've done. And so whether it's a large injury or small, we have to make that decision. Will I stay in it? Will I give that gift of grace? And for many people, that's where it's hard. Like when I think about my story about conflict, and I think back across my developmental years and kind of what I learned, what I would call the emotional rules for engaging in conflict or for engaging in tough conversations, that question of grace really becomes the prominent question. And I hear this a lot. I've heard this a lot clinically as well, is like, if there's going to be tough emotions displayed, if this is going to lead you to intensity, you might want to think about ending that relationship, or that relationship may not be good for you, and perhaps you shouldn't engage it if there's going to be strong feeling. Well, that's a miscarriage of grace. It's like, no, this relationship means a lot to me, and because it means a lot to me, I am willing to engage in a hard process. And I'm going to give myself to a hard process over time because I want this to heal.
Yeah. That's great. This is one of those hard ones where this one especially feels hard if someone feels unwilling to give grace. This is not you can't force that on anyone. That's you have to decide for yourself if that's something you want.
Well, that's one of the predictors of divorce. Or if we think about it outside of just marriage, that's a predictor of a relationship coming to an end. If a person if their disposition is to not engage or to not be willing to give of themselves into the relationship with a sense of humility and with a sense of, I'm willing to do the work, well, then there's no relationship. It's like that is a final blow that can't be recovered from. It's like the unwillingness to engage is it's almost like it's an unpardonable sin. It's like this refusal to engage is a refusal to have relationship, and there's no healing from that. Like there's no coming back from that. Yeah. It's like the only way you can have relationship is if that thing breaks or that person changes that disposition. But if that stays strong, welcome to the end of the relationship. Like you won't make progress past that point. No amount of effort. Yeah. Like just there's nothing beneath that to give it strength. And so this is why it's a predictor of divorce, is like even in the small areas, it's like if repair attempts are constantly rejected, if I'm trying to repair, let's like say we're in a conversation and I say something that's offensive to you, and I pick up on the sense that I just said something offensive. And I say, hey, Sam, can I say that again another way? That came out really wrong. Can I try that again? Well, that's a repair attempt. Sure. It's like, it's me saying, I recognize something. I want to be in it with you. But now you have a choice to make. It's like, that's a graceful decision. Right. Yes, Tim, thanks for, that was offensive, or that did hurt my feelings, but I would like to hear you out. Can say that again another way. And it's like you opening that door. Now I can say it another way and we can be on the same page. And it's like, we just strengthened that muscle. Yeah. Now you can trust me. I can trust you. We built trust together in this ability to repair a breach. When we miss these small repair attempts, if a big one happens, that oftentimes it's game over. It's like there's not a structure for repair to occur. Yeah. And so a big hit kind of it brings things to an end. So we always want to be paying attention to the small repair attempts that people make. Things like, man, my reactions were too extreme. I'm sorry. Or I really blew that one. Can I try that again? What you're saying is, and it's like, I'm an effort I want to hear you out because I responded to you poorly. Hey, let me start that again in a softer way, or just a simple, I'm sorry, will you please forgive me? Like that, I was angry and frustrated and I lashed out and I'm sorry. Yeah. Anything, if we don't accept repair, like that's a breach, like that injures the relationship or damages the ability to continue through this roadmap. So grace is that first movement. The second movement, and this is one that's very, very challenging and often takes a long time for people to wrestle through, is justice. Is relationships that are safe and healthy have to be built on justice. And justice is not retribution. It's not, justice is not about a vindictiveness or making the other person pay or punishment. It's like there are oftentimes consequences associated with justice, but that's not the thrust of justice. Like if we talk about having a just society, that means I can walk down the street in the middle of the night and not be afraid of being robbed. It's like a just society has a sense of order and a sense of purposefulness and a sense of safety built into the thing. And when that's missing, we say that this is unjust, or its injustice is running rampant. It's like it's this lack of safety. And so when
Can you give examples of like what that looks like?
Like in a relationship?
Yeah.
Or, I would say that that the way that can express itself would be if a person comes through the front door and they consistently do something that's annoying to their spouse, and their spouse has confronted them and filed the complaint, and that person has agreed to correct it and they just don't ever correct it, that's an injustice. It's like how, like you're committing the same thing over and over and over again, and you're agreeing to something, which is even another form of injury. It's like the act itself is a problem, but what's even more sinister than that is if I agree to make a change and I don't follow through. And so if I don't follow through, it's no longer about I'm kicking my shoes off at the wrong place. It's that I've agreed to something and now I won't follow through, so you can't believe me. My word is not trustworthy. And oftentimes what that would lead to, it's like, I agreed to something I really didn't agree to. And it's like, if you don't want to agree to putting your shoes away and you want to renegotiate where you put your shoes, well, then have that fight. Like, engage that and say, it's not like there's a right and wrong about where your shoes have to go. And so spouses can duke that out. And if they do, and they do it well, and they have a good strategy for what I would call a healthy fight or for resolving conflict, they'll be strengthened from that. And then wherever I take my shoes off doesn't have to persist at being an injury.
Yeah.
But if I agree to something, and I keep doing it, it's like, that's an injustice. And in more severe cases, it would like if somebody was having an affair and they're not willing to allow their spouse to know their whereabouts. So one thing that a spouse may often need is like, I need to know where you are. And so in the modern age of technology, tracking devices on our phones are very useful at people knowing where they're at. And so if a relationship's safe, there's no harm. There's no problem with my wife knowing where I'm at and being able to say, hey, I wonder where he's at, and check my phone, and, oh, he's at Kroger, he's there. And so if a person has a breach, and if there's a breach in the relationship and I just refuse to give you access to know where I'm at, well, that's an injustice. It's like that is a breach of trust within the relationship. It's like your spouse deserves to know, like, that's a gift that you can give her, or a gift that she can give him, that would help establish a sense of justice and safety.
Yeah.
And so there are, in the severe injuries, there are injustices if you continue to connect with an affair partner, even if you're not engaging in sexual activity anymore. Just the very fact of staying connected on social media or texting or like any kind of connection. It's like, if you keep doing that, that's your relationship can't heal, because justice won't be established. And so we want to actively think in terms of, in larger ways as well as small ways, how do we create safety and a sense of justice within our relationship? Yeah. And every couple,
it's actually starting to walk in the steps of repair. Like, it's actually being willing to do the work of making it better.
Right. And so when we establish justice, and each couple will find it beneficial, or every relationship will have its own sense of what is justice. Like, what does this relationship need to be safe? And that may be that will be different for your relationship than it is for mine.
Sure.
And it's often connected back to the ways in which our relationship has taken hits, or the way we as individuals have taken hits across time. Having a just and safe relationship, it's like, if there's trauma within my marriage, or if my spouse has endured a trauma in her life, and we get married, and I had nothing to do with that trauma, but there are things that I could do that would make her feel unsafe related to the trauma that she's experienced. I have a responsibility to create safety within that space. And so we have to be responsive to one another and influence each other, and be willing to say, I'm on your team and I want to create a safe relationship for you. How do I do that? And that becomes the gift that we can give. One, it's a gift of grace, but it's also a gift of justice. It's like, I'm going to work hard to create a safe space for you.
That's great.
The next movement is empathy. And empathy is it's a process of saying, I want to understand you as it relates to the conflict. So this is a place within a relationship of a lot of give and take, of I want to hear it from your perspective. I want to validate it. So each each person is able to start telling the story of what they've experienced within that injury or within the relationship, and what they were experiencing, what they were feeling, and being able to discuss that and be validated by the other in that conversation. Now, empathy is really hard for people, oftentimes because they believe that if they empathize, that means they're agreeing with the conclusions of the other person. And so if you're frustrated with something and I validate your feelings and I talk about and I get it, okay, I hear how frustrated you are. This was really hard for you. It's like to do that almost feels like that means I'm going to accept your interpretation of the events, and that means I agree with you.
Yes,
and
that definitely makes sense. And
it keeps a lot of people from ever really developing a sense of empathy, because it's like, no, I have something to tell you. I have you need to get this, because if you understood me, you wouldn't feel the way you feel. And so there becomes this battle of who's going to get understood first. And empathy and in healthy relationships, it doesn't matter who gets understood first. There's a commitment by both people to say, I want to hear this out from your perspective, and okay, I get where you're at. And so in large injuries, that's a much more complicated process. In the smaller injuries and the smaller conflicts that we have if we have a relatively healthy relationship, but we have these smaller injuries, empathy is this sense of like, okay, I can hear you out. It makes sense what you're saying. If I think the thoughts that you think, if I had the experiences that you had, I put myself in your spot, I can see how you got there. And that makes sense to me. And the other person can do the same. And so we're validating the reality of the other person. Within empathy then is we also accept responsibility. It's like we're beginning to have this sense of like, oh, I can see from your perspective how I brought something to this that hurt you. And so I'm willing to accept responsibility for my contribution to the conflict. And both people now are understanding each other and taking personal responsibility. And so when two people both do that, it's like now you're setting up the framework for healing. It's like, I get it how we got here. It doesn't mean that I agree with you. It doesn't mean what you did's okay. It just means I get it. I understand how you got there. And now we can have this responsibility taking, this sense of engaging with one another. And we can begin to start untangling and say, what would protect us? What would strengthen us to keep us from getting back into this cycle or back into this kind of injury? And that's the part that's the strengthening of the muscle as that heals. It's like, sure, we understand each other better than we did before this conflict. And that's to our benefit, because if I understand you and you understand me better, well, we'll be strengthened. We'll have a higher quality level of interaction with each other. Does that make sense?
That definitely makes sense. Yeah, that's great. And I can see how that's where it starts to turn. Like you said, the muscles actually starting to get strengthened when that happens.
Right. And so the next thing that happens is not so much a decision as it is an outgrowth of the work that we just did. So if we have grace for each other, we set the relationship right, with justice is established and there's safety. And we spend all of this time really deeply understanding each other and validating and expressing and having a dialogue about and responsibility taking, and all of that kind of process is happening. The next thing that's inevitable to happen is trust. It's like, how would I not trust you?
Sure.
It's like if you're willing to engage in all of this work and all of this process, my trust for you is going to grow, despite the fact that there was an injury. It's like I can, at the least, I can just trust that if an injury happens again, we'll go through this process again, that you know how to repair, and I can trust that if something happens, you'll be willing to take responsibility. You'll be willing to do this work with me. And so I start to trust you. And it's like, there are times we need to make a decision about trust, especially in the larger infractions or injuries to a relationship. we can have flash responses and kind of like trauma responses to something. And it's like, oh, okay, no, we did all of this work together. It's reasonable for me to trust her. It's reasonable for me to trust him because of everything we've done. But we might have to make a decision about that and remind ourselves of that. For many of the injuries, it's like we don't actively think about it. It's just like trust grows. And then the final movement is forgiveness. And forgiveness is like this sense of, I'm not going to use this injury as a weapon against you. So if I do, I have now perpetrated a new injury on the relationship. If I hurt you and we went through this whole process of making it right, and then we have another conflict emerging, and I pull this one out of my hat as a weapon against you, and I say, you remember when you did X? It's like that usage of injuries that have been repaired is a brand new injury. It's like you've just pulled the thread that's going to unravel a great deal. It's going to create that's a massive injury to a relationship. It's like that's another. It's like that's its own brand new injury.
And I think that just proves that the first four stops haven't actually been hit. Like if you are continuing to weaponize the injury, it's because you don't trust them, you don't have empathy. There still isn't a sense of justice, or it's not a safe place, and if there's no grace involved either. So it's right. If you get to this fifth one here and there is no forgiveness, I think that's evidence that the first four haven't actually been stopped at.
Very, very. I would say that, and very much so, is forgiveness, like trust, kind of grows. It emerges from that process. And it's like there's always an element. I think the willingness to engage in this process is what I would call to have a forgiving heart to people in conflict. And so there's you could construe this as being a pathway of forgiveness. Like to engage in this at all is to have a forgiving heart and a willingness to forgive. Where many people run amok in conflict is they try to go backwards through this list. And there's a lot of religious pressure, or this deep knowledge that forgiveness is a primary responsibility and expectation of a believer, and so forgiveness is the first step. And so someone does something wrong, I'm sorry, Sam. But we don't do any of those other processes. And so I'm still kind of smarting from the injury. We haven't really talked it out. We haven't really done any repair work. It's just that, okay, you're acknowledging, yep, will you forgive me? Oftentimes that's born out of, I want the pain to just go away and I want to stop having the problem. And how about we not talk about it anymore? And let's just ignore it all and make it all go away. And it's really not forgiveness at all that I'm looking for. It's just that I'm looking for you to ignore my stupidity or my injury or my lack of sensitivity. And so please ignore it. Please don't hold me accountable for it. Please forgive me. But I'm going to keep doing exactly what I've been doing. I'm not actually going to be changing. I don't have a repentant heart. And so then the other person says, well, they have a spiritual responsibility to forgive. Okay, great. I forgive you. But now that person has difficulty trusting, because this is the fifth time. This is a pattern behavior. Like this is going to happen again. It's just a matter of time.
Yeah. And
so it's like, now I don't trust you, but I'll forgive you, but I don't trust you. And it's like, well, no, you didn't forgive. Like, it's like there's not, you haven't healed the relational space. You might want to forgive. You might say you forgive, but oftentimes if we try to go backwards through this list, it's not true forgiveness. It's not like we really reconciled and repaired anything. It's that we pasted something over top of the injury and said we're going to ignore it. And that's a false forgiveness. It's not a true repentant kind of process. And then what happens is then the person who's not having difficult trusting, they've been wounded by the other person. Now they have difficulty trusting, and the other person has the gall to say, well, you said you forgave me. Why don't you trust me? And it's like, as though now the person who was originally injured is the person that's the problem. And it's like, the problem is that you don't trust, and you said you forgave, but you don't. See, you're really the problem. And that's the sentiment that often emerges from this trying to go backwards through this list. It's like that's really jacked up. That's relationally unsustainable.
Oh my goodness. But I feel like that's just what you've described, though, is so relatable. I feel like so many people do experience that. Maybe not on, I mean, I'm sure some people on like with big intense things, but also just in the daily small things. I feel like that can really insert itself into a relationship, very quickly.
Right. And I think like there's the beauty and the gift of forgiveness is tremendous. Like that sense in which I can release someone from this injury that I sustained. It's like the gift of forgiveness is a wonderful gift. And there are times that we forgive and we don't have ongoing relationship. Like if someone injures me, I may forgive them and never have relationship with them again. There may be no context for relationship. But if we think we can do this, I forgive you, and then stay in meaningful relationship without that whole process, we're deceiving ourselves. And many people misapply when Jesus talks about you forgive 7 times in a day, and you forgive. It's like, yes, we must maintain a forgiving heart. We cannot allow. I think what Jesus is teaching us to do is do not nurture resentment. Don't hold a grudge. Don't take something Paul calls it a root of bitterness. Like, don't allow the injuries of another person to lodge themselves so deeply that you become resentful, bitter, and filled with malice and resentment, and then you become a biting, cutting person who's unforgiving and angry all the time. And so Jesus, like an imperative to be a forgiving person is to protect us from resentment and malice. If we want healthy relationship, we can't go backwards through that list and really never get to the justice component or to that sense of we're going to heal the real stuff. We're going to really get after it and repair it.
Yeah. And I think and I think we entered into this conversation. I think we said this explicitly, but if we did not, we're saying it now. This is repair to relationships that we already have. There's significant relationships with us, like that we have in our life. Like, obviously, there are things that happen in this world where an offense is made, but it's not with like a close relationship that we want to restore and maintain. Like, there are things that happen in life by a third party that hurt us that we don't want to maintain that relationship. That was never a relationship we wanted in the first place. That's a little bit different type of thing where it's like, to forgive them. We're not seeking the restoration of that relationship per se, but we're talking about the relationships we value and already have right now.
Right. There's certainly some application like to within groups and nations and societies and communities that can follow this roadmap. It has to be amended to some degree for like usefulness in group. I actually believe it is very useful in thinking about group violations or group injuries. But even still, it's the sense that we want to go through this process so that we can be together in a meaningful way.
Right.
An intimate relationship, this cuts way deeper. We're not going to have the same level and depth of relationship with all people everywhere. And so there's an element of what the proverb says, that love covers a multitude of sins. It's like we don't want to become a nitpicky person that every little injury just flares up into some big thing. And there's things that we just let go. It's like we don't, the idiosyncrasies of another person, it's like if we just become nitpicky about it, that's its own, that's not about justice. It's like then the nitpicking is an injustice of its own. And so we want to be gracious and deferring and be generous and not make a deal out of everything. many people default on the other side of they just ignore everything, and things that ought to have some conflict, that people just don't engage it because they're scared or they don't trust the relationship. But I'm hopeful that I want to learn this process more and more in my own personal life, because I think it's the pathway towards relational satisfaction. But it does take two people to engage, or it does take a willingness to say we're going to engage this. We're going to engage this together, and we're going to both take responsibility. And if we do that, we can heal. Marriages with severe injuries can heal. Marriages that are just dying by 1,000 little paper cuts and no massive big injury that you can point to, but it's like we're bleeding all over the place from this inability to repair. Both can follow this kind of roadmap.
What for the relationship that relates to the paper cut thing, where it's little thing after little thing, no repair. What would you say is a good starting point for that? Because that one feels, if you had one significant event that needs repair, in a sense that almost seems an easier starting place, because you have something very clear to like address and focus on. For the person who's got the paper cut situation, where do you start? Like what's a good place to start there? Does that question make sense?
Yeah, it sure does. I think a good place to start is by identifying the patterns that inform a relationship. And this may actually be a great question for a follow-up podcast. Is when we look at what's the patterns within a relationship. So when I think about marriage counseling, when I think about helping an organization, like you always want to be looking at patterns more than the content of any particular story. And so it's like, what is the way we interact with each other? And so if you think about like a figure eight, with that center line down the middle, is on each side is each person in the relationship. And it's like something happens, somebody does something, and that is, we can think about it as like a trigger, or that's like a switch. It's like it flips the switch. It's like, okay, something happened, that behavior activated something for me. And in that activation, for me, it begins to set up a defensive process, a sense that I don't know if I can trust you. I'm not happy about this. Something's not working right.
Yep.
Invariably, what that does is it has an emotional component to it. I feel a certain way. My behaviors begin to flow from that. My thinking gets distorted in that space. And that leads me to action. I do something. And invariably, whatever I do becomes the trigger point for the other person. So now we're back. We went through the figure eight, and we're coming.
You trigger me, I trigger you.
And we're coming back, and now my responses to whatever it was now is a new thing for the other person, and it activates the thoughts, feelings, emotions process. And that leads again back to an action or a response of some sort, which invariably will exacerbate and escalate and create a new trigger. And the one of the first steps for a couple is to figure out and say, this is our pattern.
Yeah.
We're not going to judge the pattern. We're not going to say it's just that this is the way it goes. And invariably, you can think through, when I think back to conflicts within my family or with my wife, invariably they follow the same pattern.
Yep.
And it's often the same things. By the time the fight is over, the same things are being said. They've been said 100 times, and we're saying them all over again, and no one's listening to each other, and no one really takes that space. It's like there's no capacity within the relationship for those things that get said to actually mean anything, because both people are kind of in their own corner, licking their wounds and thinking about how right they are in comparison to the other person.
Yep.
And so understanding that pattern, and both people with humility saying, yes, there it is. That's our pattern. That is what we do. It's a little bit like the first step of AA, like in Alcoholics Anonymous. It's like we've come to understand that our lives are unmanageable and out of control. Like we are stuck in a pattern, and unless we acknowledge that this pattern has us and we created it, it's like each of us in our relationships have created the unique pattern within the relationship. I created it, and I co-created it with what my wife and I have. I co-created with her, and she co-created with me. That might be the very first responsibility step, where we can be non-defensive and say, I am responsible for that pattern. I am a co-creator of it. Much like you and I are co-creators of this podcast. It's like we may bring different skill sets and different stuff to it, but we created it, and it's ours. And it's the patterns we have in our relationship. We created it, and we're responsible for it. And until we can take responsibility, we probably won't figure out how to break out of that.
Sure.
And me trying to convince my wife that she's responsible, and her trying to convince me that I'm responsible, we're just reinforcing the power of the pattern. I would say that's probably the first step, is just acknowledging like there's a pattern that's outside of our control. And it's particularly outside of our control if we don't understand it, see it, validate it. And when we start to do that, now we can begin to say, maybe I can bring about change in this pattern. When this happens and I respond differently, I can change. I can be the exit ramp from this toxic kind of process that can ensue. And I can listen differently. I can listen to like, what's the dream that the other person has? Like, what are they fighting for? Like, there's something deeper than the trivial content. Like, I don't know how many times across my career in marriage counseling, people come in and talk about how bad they feel in their relationship and how bad their fight was. And they're like, but we can't remember what we were fighting about.
Yeah.
And I've experienced that. It's like, here I am. It's like, I don't even really remember the actual content of the fight, but boy, do I ever remember how I felt from it. And those are devastating spaces. But what it points to is that we don't need to just solve problems. We need to correct patterns. And so correcting the pattern, identifying it and correcting the pattern is way more important than agreeing on the content.
That's good. Good. That's really helpful. That's a great place to start, because then I think once you can, and especially once you can understand your contribution to the pattern, is where then you can start to see, like, here is, and like, as a pattern, how I'm creating a hurt in this relationship that needs repair, and then you can start working on the grace, justice, empathy, trust, forgiveness type stuff once you have that pattern. I think that's, I don't know, hearing you talk about that in particular, the need to identify the pattern, man, once you do that and you're willing to start enter into that, I feel like that has so much potential.
It's very hopeful.
Oh yeah. And
it's
so much potential for like real change to happen in a marriage. Because I think a lot of people, I'm sure, can relate to that idea. Like, man, we're here again. We've had this conversation so many times, but it's not changed. At least my wife and I can understand that. So.
Right. Yeah. It's a very hopeful space. There's also like we need to foster an internal disposition towards the other person. John Gottman in his research calls it developing positive sentiment. And positive sentiment is having this disposition towards the other person rather than away from them, rather than like it's like, I think about you in positive ways and I want what's best for you. And so I'm willing to be in conflict with you, but I am very much oriented to your needs being met. I want your needs to be met. And so if I'm in a conflict with you, I am listening I want to hear what is it that you need, because what you need is so dang important to me. And I want your needs to be met. I might not be able to meet them. Like, I don't have to feel some sense of like, I'm your Messiah and Savior and I have to meet every single one of your needs. Like that's its own that's its own issue that people have to grapple with. If I think I can meet every single one of your needs in a marriage, it's like, well, wrong. Like, that's not going to happen. But I do want your needs to be met. And I want to be a facilitator in helping that occur. So I want to listen carefully to what you need and adapt as much as I am able in ways that can help meet that need. And when two people are disposed that way towards each other, that's where compromise can come from. It's like, it can be like, I can compromise, and it's not that I'm giving up something of myself. It's actually that I'm engaging in something that will actually enhance the relationship, which is to my benefit. It accrues to my compromise accrues to my benefit, because the relationship is prioritized over the individual. And when both people are willing to say, I want to hear you out, we're at an intractable space. Like there's not we can't both be right or both get our way right now. We're going to have to find a compromise. And there are times where there is no compromise. It's either one way or the other. And it's like, if it's like, I want to have another baby, I don't, there's no compromise. There are situations in relationships where compromise it's like somebody's going to yield. Like, it's going to go one way or the other. And there's not and it's like whoever gives up, or whoever like says, okay, I'm willing to surrender, the other person has to validate the loss and the grief and the sense of, you're giving something significant to the relationship, and you didn't owe it to the relationship. So if you defer to what I want, I really need to honor that sacrifice and see that as a real sacrifice. And when we can do that, we'll build positive sentiment, and it actually makes me sacrificing for the relationship actually an opportunity for strengthening the relationship. It's like, I feel better about it. But those are nuanced ways of understanding conflict. Many people don't ever get to those kinds of spots because they stay trapped in the patterns that are hurting them.
Yep. Wow, that's great.
Well, that might be a good stopping point.
So.
Like, I have a hunch that talking about marriage is one of those things in relationships that we could go on for a very long time, and it would merit a lot of conversation about. And so we'll certainly return back to conversations about healthy relationships and how to enhance and deepen the quality of relationships in future podcasts as well. Definitely.
And for those of you listening, if there was something that prompted more questions for you, we'd love to hear them. We want to be able to dialogue with people who are listening. We want this to be helpful, so give us a shout. We got an email in the show notes that we've included, so we'd love to hear feedback and thoughts.
Sounds great. Thanks to all of you for listening, and see you next time.
We hope you enjoyed this week's episode of Guideposts with Dr. Tim Stauffer. If you're finding this podcast beneficial, please share it with a friend or leave us a review. Also, make sure to check out the show notes where you can find links to resources as well as an email address. We want to hear from you. Send us your questions, feedback, and topic ideas for future episodes. Thanks for listening.